met you before. I'm Jenny, and I'm the Associate Minister here at Werbs. And as always, it's such a joy to be able to come and to share with you a bit from God's Word this morning. But to start with a story. A few years ago, so my mum lives quite close to the beach, and a few years ago she had a spare 10 minutes coming back from somewhere. So she thought she would go that morning for a quick walk on the beach. She hadn't been on the beach for quite a while. Unfortunately, within a couple of minutes of being on the beach, she got knocked over by an out-of-control puppy. It ran up behind her and knocked her flying. So she fell onto the floor, and the really unhelpful, we're going to call him, dog owner, just said to her, "There's nothing wrong with you. Like, get up, stop making a fuss." And he walked off and left her on the beach on her own. The problem was, there was something wrong with my mum. She'd completely shattered her hip, and apparently her leg was out at a funny angle. That dog owner wasn't my most favourite person for a while, but I have forgiven him. So that was the bad news. The reality of the situation was it was a cold day. My mum was left on the beach, unable to move, with a rapidly incoming tide. The good news of the story, that's not the end, there is good news. The good news of the story is that there was a minibus driver who volunteered for a local elderly care home, and he decided that afternoon to take some of the residents out for a drive. And they were up on this cliff top, enjoying the view, having a lovely time, when he saw this played out. In my head, I don't know if this next bit is true, he drove really fast down the cliff. He probably drove within the speed limit, but I like to think he raced down there. He left the elderly residents in the van. He, locked them in safely, put the heating on, and he ran to the beach. And when he got there and discovered that my mum simply couldn't move, he ran the Coast Guard and the air helicopter and I want to call it, not the air helicopter, the air ambulance, and I want to call it the normal ambulance, the one which comes on roads. And so they came, and my mum got the help which she needed. And it's one of those things you just don't want to dwell on too much. What would have happened if he wasn't there? But actually, every time I see the reality of the situation, I feel so much more grateful for that minibus driver. I feel so much more grateful that he stepped in and he helped my mum. But if I'd kind of shared that story this morning, and I hadn't really told you the bad news, if I just kind of said, "Oh, one day my mum was on the beach and this minibus driver helped her," you'd kind of think, "Oh, great story, thanks, Jenny." But it wouldn't really sink in. But there's something, as we stop and we see what the situation really was, and we see that clearly, we see how good the good news is that that minibus driver was there and he chose to step in and rescue my mum. We are right now, as a church, I was going to say in the middle, we're actually not in the middle, we're only on week 2 of looking at the book of Romans. And Romans is this book in the New Testament which was written many years ago. And it was written to the Christians in Rome, these Christians who met not in big gatherings, but in homes. And they were written this letter by the Apostle Paul. And in it, the chapter, or the part we're looking at today over a couple of chapters, it is, if you like, it's Paul painting that beach scene. He's showing us the reality of the situation. He's showing us a little bit of what some of the bad news is. But he's doing that so we can see how good the good news is. And Paul says this in Romans 3:23, kind of summing it up. He says that we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. In other words, all of us, if we're a human being, we will have messed up in some way. That there are times in our lives, and quite often quite a lot of times in our lives, when the things we do, they don't meet God's standards. And this kind of verse shows us that there's no exceptions. He's not just talking to one group of people. Actually, he's saying for all of us as humans, this applies. And Paul then goes on and he paints this picture a little bit more of what does it mean when we say that we've fallen short of God's standards, short of his glory. He shows us quite clearly how broken the world is in which we live and how he feels about it. But these truths, as we look at some verses which are quite hard verses in some ways to read, these verses aren't there to feel bad. We're not talking about this morning to make everyone feel bad, but actually these verses are there from a loving God to help us. And so as I speak today, hold on, that there's good news coming. But for us to fully see how good this good news is, we need to have a look at what the other news is first. The other thing to consider as well is that this letter, which was written to the Christians in Rome, they didn't have it in chapters. It wouldn't be that they'd look at one little bit, and then one little bit, and then one little bit. Actually, they'd look at the whole letter. They'd have that letter read to them, and they'd look at it kind of together. But we are just homing in on one part today. But this part sets the scene, and we're going to then move on and look at different things, different weeks coming out of this. So next week, for example, we're thinking about what's so amazing about grace. So if you've got Bibles and you want to turn to them in front of you, do. It would also be coming up on the screens. And we're covering a few chapters today. There simply isn't time to go through every verse in the book of Romans. We'd be here for weeks. So we're looking at a couple of little bits today. And I'm going to follow Amy's example, who was here a couple of weeks ago. She gave away a book. This is giving you your prep so you can be ready to say you'd like it. This book called Loved by Johnny Gumbel. It's all about the book of Romans. And I found it such a helpful book. So I bought an extra copy. So would anyone like this morning to take away, to have? It's a gift. Everyone's looking suspicious. Elizabeth, come and get it. I will leave it here for you. Brilliant. There you go. There is your book. My pleasure. So, back to the Bible. Romans 1, verse 18 says this. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. As Paul begins to unfold what is wrong with the world, he sums it up and he says at the heart of the problem is that as humans, rather than worshipping the Creator, that we start to worship these created things. And really right at the heart of sin is when we put other things in the place in which God should be in our lives. Is when we substitute for God false things which we called idols. And for the people that Paul was writing to back in the day, the city of Rome at that time, it was filled with temples. And people went and they worshipped idols. And when they did it, it was almost in this bargaining way. It was, if I do this for you, will you do this for me? It was full of bribery and superstition. And it went so far that actually that the things that the people wanted to do, then they kind of made it as this sacrifice to God. So they ended up having things like ritual prostitutes. And they would justify that. And they would say, we're going to do it because it's going to please the gods. And though nowadays we perhaps don't have these idols built in the same way, which we go and we sacrifice to, it can be really easy for things to slip into our lives, which suddenly become more important than God. And often these things, actually in and of themselves, they're not bad. They can be really good things. But it's when it's those things and suddenly they become our real driving force in life, or they become the place where our security comes, that actually all of a sudden we're kind of tipped into the wrong place. It can be, for example, I had a crate this morning of how busy gyms are on a Sunday morning. And going to a gym is a good thing. I'm definitely not saying that we shouldn't go to the gym. Looking after ourselves and keeping fit is a really healthy thing to do. And I say that to myself knowing I actually need to do more of it. But when that becomes almost like our God, when our obsession comes in having this perfect body or being super, super fit, and all of a sudden we don't have time for God because that's all we can focus on, that's when it's not right. And it can be the same with all sorts of different things like material possessions or success or being popular. All of a sudden, that becomes what we're aiming for. And so this is what Paul is saying, is don't replace worshipping the incredible God with something else. Because we're all hardwired to worship. And so if we're not worshipping God, we'll end up worshipping something else. And then Paul goes on in Romans 3, verses 9 to 20, and says, what shall we conclude then? Do we have any advantage? Not at all. For we've already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Going on to verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. As I've said, there's good news coming. But these verses, they tell us that none of us is righteous, that on our own, through our own merit, none of us can stand right before God. So how do we respond with the things which are wrong in our lives? And this is a little bit with the illustration of my mum falls down, because actually at that moment on her beach, it wasn't her fault that she got knocked over. But when deep down we know that we have messed up, how do we respond to it? Well, I think there's a couple of different ways, and I can fall into both these categories. One is that we can deny it. We can deny it. We can not take responsibility. We cannot look at the reality of the situation. Even though my mum hadn't done anything wrong, she kind of needed to be aware of the situation she was in. But interestingly, the dog walker's response, wasn't it, was just to take no responsibility. This is nothing to do with me. And often with small children, one of the things we do is we try and teach them from quite a young age to take responsibility. So if they've done something wrong, we teach them to say sorry. But if you've got children of your own, or ever worked with them, or perhaps just been close to them, we know that actually it doesn't come naturally to children always to say sorry. Or how often, I can still remember blaming my brother, like you've been in an argument. You were innocent. It was always your siblings' fault. How often did you say to your parents, it was all me, not them? We love to blame others. And when I mess up now, sometimes we're going to come to this one in a moment, I can feel shame in a really unhelpful way. But other times I can be a bit more like that child. And I can justify what I've done wrong. I wonder if you can relate to any of those. Well, I only responded like that. I only got wound up in that moment because of what they said or they did. You know, you'd have to be a saint, wouldn't you, not to get upset when you've just been faced with that. Or perhaps I deny my true motives to myself. Or I compare myself to others and say, well, you know, I exaggerated the truth a bit, but it's not like I've lied like that person lies. Or the one I think I often do is when I say, I don't know what happened there. I was so out of character. I was not myself. And I thought that was quite a good one. And I was at a conference literally only 10 days ago, and they were saying how often we say that to ourselves. And he shared this much better than I could, but basically he stood there and said, well, if you weren't being yourself, who else were you being? You know, you are only yourself. But I think so often when we've messed up, we love to try and justify it. Almost our pride comes in. And it's quite hard at times to admit and say, you know what? I got that wrong. But deep down, I know I'm a work in progress. I know me. I'm with me all the time. I know there are parts of me that aren't as Christ-like as I'd like them to be. And those verses in Romans, that they feel quite strong, where they say that no one seeks God, we've all turned away. And overall, I long to seek God. Overall, I long to follow his ways, which is good news as a church leader. That is where my heart is. But there's also times there's a battle within. And even though I know God's ways, there's this battle within and I want to do things my way. Or I think, well, why in that moment do I have to say sorry? Again, then those excuses come back in. But I know I mess up. Because if right now, everything I'd ever thought, said, done, that didn't honour God was to come up on a screen and scroll through, it would be truly awkward. I don't think I'd ever come back here again. It wouldn't be good, would it? It wouldn't be good for any of us. It's not going to happen, don't worry. I'm not about to do that. And it's not, helpful to have everything exposed. But the other extreme is that sometimes, and I think sometimes within the church, we can put on these masks as well. And actually we pretend that everything is fine and we're not struggling with these different areas. And, we can put on that smile and perhaps inside that's not what we're feeling. And actually we're feeling really angry about things. And there's something also as we put these masks on, that also doesn't help us to move forward. There needs to be this balance. This passage, it talks about the law, which is God's ways we see in the Old Testament. And it's saying that can't save us. Only as we trust Jesus, it can. But actually, as we look at God's words and we allow the Holy Spirit within us, it helps us to become conscious of those things which aren't right. I was reading this article last week, which I just found really helpful. Andy Bond, who's the church leader of one of our church plants, he loves to send articles to read. And he sent me this article from the Gospel Coalition. And it said this, and it was written by someone who's recently graduated from Oxford University. And she's just talking about this shift within culture. And actually the encouraging part of the article was there's so much more openness coming to God. But this is what she said. Having a religious faith, some sort of trellis on which to build your emotional and moral life, sounds less tiring than conjuring your own beliefs and ethical systems. The anxiety that's become a trademark of our generation is only aggravated by the moral uncertainty of our times. And she went on to say, the word sin creeps in as a relief, a concrete way to label something right or wrong. And I thought that's so interesting, isn't it? We're almost in a culture where anything goes as long as it doesn't hurt someone else, though how we sometimes know what's going to hurt someone else. But then deep down, we also know that things are right or wrong. And we know that sometimes we get it wrong. And even sometimes, within church, we don't want people to feel bad. And so we struggle to ever talk about sin. And so I found that really helpful, that actually there's something within it of us being able to admit things is actually really helpful. Because I think when we have the courage to look into our own hearts, this letter to the Romans, it actually resonates with what we know about ourselves. Because we know we mess up. I know that my heart isn't as pure as I'd like it to be. I'm working on it with God's help. But there are times when I'm not as kind or as generous or as loving or as patient, and the list goes on, as I could be. And there's something freeing about being honest. Andrew Ollerton, in his book, he's written this brilliant commentary on the book of Romans, and he says, however, despite what we've been told about ourselves, Romans resonates deeply with what we know about ourselves. Romans 3:19, and those bits that I've just read, says this, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. And in the time of this letter to Romans, in the Roman court of law, when a defendant had nothing left to say, they would simply put their hand in front of their mouth. And so for me, there's this picture in this, or the image of this is almost us before God saying, okay, No more excuses, God. I can see that actually in this situation, I've messed up. So that is one side about us taking responsibility. But sometimes the other way we can go is that we can spiral into this place of despair, of, I'm so awful, I'm never going to change. And you can feel this deep shame, which is really unhelpful as well. I remember, and that's never from God, which we're going to come to in a moment. I remember years ago I was doing some supply teaching. I turned up at this school for the first time, and I was greeted with being told that the class I was about to teach, that they never put a supply teacher in because the class was so out of control. They'd failed Ofsted on behaviour. So you can imagine I was like, oh joy, this is going to be great. And I walked in, and literally even before I'd taken the register, things were flying in this classroom. And so the best way I can describe it is I herded as many children as I could to the carpet. And I probably prayed in that situation. And I remember just thinking, I need to turn this round. And so the class had been told, time and time again, you're the worst class we've ever had, all of that. And I thought, no, I'm going to change this narrative. And so I said to them, I'm really looking forward to teaching you today. And they were like, why, miss? We're awful. Like, why? And I was like, no. We are going to have a really great day. And there was this one little boy. It's one of those things which just stays with you. I can't remember his name. We're going to call him Jimmy. I don't know why Jimmy. No reason. And he was being particularly disruptive, wasn't on the carpet. And so I just said, and I'm really looking forward to teaching Jimmy. And all the class had already told me everything wrong he'd ever done. You know how they love to tell you. And I was, he's so naughty, miss. And I was like, no, I don't think he is, actually. I think Jimmy's going to be super helpful today. And actually, this little boy then, all day, he was like my little right-hand man. And he behaved beautifully. But the point of the story was, and it stuck with me because it was so heartbreaking. And at the end of the day, as the other children left, he came up to me and he said, I need to tell you something, miss. And I was like, what? He said, I am that boy they told you about. I'm bad, I'm naughty, I'm always rude, I never normally like this, I'm not helpful. And I remember almost hearing that deep shame within him. And he'd taken on those labels, and as a result, he acted it out. It didn't help him having those. And I remember, he's one of those children, you just want to know what happened to him in a way. Just saying, no, you're not. You might have been told that, but you're not. But again, I think sometimes for us, we can end up feeling this deep shame, which isn't helpful. That's the kind of other extreme of not taking responsibility. And Brené Brown, who is an author and a podcaster, she makes, and I love her, I often quote from her, she makes this really helpful distinction between guilt and shame. And she says that guilt is when we hold up the things that we've done or not done to our values, and we feel a bit uncomfortable about it, and we're like, that doesn't match up. And that can help us. But shame is that inner, almost, I think the way I feel it when I know I've got it, it's almost that crippling feeling of you just want to hide away. You feel so bad about yourself. It's that you feel you're unlovable, or, there's something wrong with me. And that isn't from God. That's never from God. The Holy Spirit comes and he convicts us. He nudges us. He's like, was that good? Was that helpful? And that helps us with his help to then move forward. Say, oh no, actually that's not so good in my life. With your help, God, I want to change that. Shame is when you feel condemned and it cripples you and it makes you want to hide away. God says to us, whatever we are, his word to you is that he loves you. So if you have a voice in your head saying you're worthless, or you're rubbish, or you're not lovable, or you can never be forgiven, or if anyone knew that about you, that is not God. God's voice over you is whatever you've done. My arms are open wide. Come and receive love and forgiveness, and let me help you to change. But the thing is, even when we take responsibility for the things we've done wrong, even when we say we want to change, Romans 3, verse 20 says this, therefore no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. There's actually almost nothing we can do to save ourselves. A bit like my mum when she was on that beach. There was nothing she could physically do to get herself off. She needed help. And the incredible thing with God is that he confronts what is wrong, but he then provides a solution. He doesn't just leave us in the mess. And we so often rightly, we talk about this incredible love of God. But we don't so often talk about the wrath of God or the anger of God. And I wonder now, even if I mention it, if it makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. But Emil Brunner, who was a Swiss theologian, says this: the wrath of God is the love of God. The wrath of God is the love of God. So what does he mean by that? Often when we think about anger, we think about human anger. And sometimes that human anger is rightly placed. There can be a righteous anger, which is right. But often with anger, it might not be. It might be an unfair anger, an out of control, a damaging one. I think we know in ourselves, when you've really lost it and you lash out and it makes you feel horrible, or when you're lashed out at. And so I think when we hear anger, we think of this kind of chaotic, out of control one. That is never God's anger. The Bible tells us that he's slow to anger and abounding in love. But actually, God's anger is a recognition that something is wrong and needs to change. The love of God compels him to respond to the injustice in the world. When we look across the world, I don't know if you sometimes hear or you see things on the news, and it makes you just feel a bit sick when stuff which is so wrong within our world. And I don't want to follow a God who sees those things and is like, doesn't bother me. Doesn't bother me what goes on in the world. I want a God who is a God of justice, who sees those things which are wrong in the world and is moved because he loves us and he cares for us so much. That is what this wrath of God is about. And with each of us, he loves us and he cares for us so much. So when we put those idols in the place of him, it bothers him because he loves us and he wants us to be in relationship with him. Johnny Gumbel in the book Loved, which Elizabeth's now got, so she'll be able to read this fully in the chapter. But he puts it in a really helpful way. It's one of the many gems in that book. He says, God's anger brought him from heaven to earth to deal once and for all with everything that is wrong with the world. He did not do this by taking his anger out on humanity, but by absorbing the anger into himself on the cross. Isn't that the most beautiful thing? That God dealt with what was wrong in the world, the things that we've done wrong, by taking it upon himself on the cross. God knew we couldn't rescue ourselves, so he did what we couldn't do for ourselves. And he came to earth and he chose to die on the cross so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be declared righteous before God. That is an amazing thing. And I think as we pause and we see the reality of our lives without Jesus coming to the cross, it reminds us of the power and the beauty of the cross. It reminds us how good the good news of Jesus is. Can I invite the band to come up, please? When we realise the mess we're in without the gospel, suddenly the news of the gospel becomes so powerful. And the world today so badly needs to hear this good news. As we work through the book of Romans, my prayer for us as a church is that we are going to grow more confidence in the news of the gospel, in how good news it is. And actually, that as that confidence grows within us, it means that we'll take this good news out to the world so that others can know this freedom, so that others can know the forgiveness, the love of God, and the difference he makes. And in a moment, we are going to share communion together. And whenever we come and we take communion, we always start, you'll have probably noticed, with the words of the confession. We always start by having this opportunity to say sorry before God. And I think there's two things, well, probably more than two things I'm going to highlight, which is amazing about that. Partly it gives us that opportunity to come again and to say sorry and to receive that forgiveness. But I think there's also something so beautiful that as we recognize the need for forgiveness, it reminds us again of the power of the cross. It reminds us of why Jesus died and how important it is that we stop and we remember it and we say thank you to him. And so to do it, to prepare, to give ourselves an opportunity, including myself, to respond, in a moment we are going to sing a chorus. It's called the Hymn of Apology. And it gives us that opportunity just to come before God and to bring those things before him that actually we want to come and say, God, I'm going to stop making excuses. Almost that moment where we put our hand in front of our own mouth and say, I'm here, God. I need to know your love and your forgiveness again. And so we're going to have almost that time between us and God. And then as the words of that finish, we'll move together into saying the words of the confession. And it might be that you're here and you don't walk with God. You've never really heard the gospel. You've never known of that opportunity to come and say sorry to God. But do you know, you can just sit where you are and you can chat to God and you can talk to him about those things. So why don't we take that moment and let's respond before God. Can I pray for us? Father, I want to thank you for your incredible love. I want to thank you that though we know we do get things wrong and we mess up, that your arms of forgiveness are always there, open wide. And I pray, will you give us now the courage to come before you and to acknowledge those things that perhaps we want to run away from in our own hearts and our own lives. Thank you, God.